In some special circumstances, the buyer will be the registered person and seller will not be the registered person. Okay, tax invoice is very much important. So if we don't have tax invoice, then we are not eligible to claim input tax credit, that is ITC. The tax is applicable on reverse charge basis. So when reverse charge is applicable, when the supplier is an unregistered dealer, then the reverse charge concept will arise. Hello everyone, I am Arun Kumar, lecturer in Department of Commerce and Management, Vidhyaashram First Grade College, the Temple of Excellence, MYSURU. Dear students, welcome to this new session on unit number 3, that is tax invoice. So in this session, you are going to learn what is the meaning of invoice, what does it really mean, and the invoice under GST. So what is invoice under GST, how the GST authority determine the invoice, and importance of tax invoice under GST, why it is important, the GST is, the tax invoice is important under GST, that you are going to learn, and contents of invoice. So what and all the items included in invoice and what and all the items should be there in invoice, about this you are going to learn, and the pro forma of invoice, how the invoice should be, how it should looks like, about that you are going to learn. So moving on, meaning of invoice. So here, generally speaking, an invoice is a commercial instrument issued by a seller to a buyer. Yes, invoice is an instrument, it is a commercial instrument issued by a seller to a buyer. Yes, if I am purchasing any product, the seller is going to issue a bill, is going to give you a receipt. That receipt or that bill is going to be called as invoice. But here, in general sense, they are going to give receipt where they are not going to be mentioned the rate of tax applicable on the product. But in invoice, they have to mention the rate of tax applicable on that particular product, on the sales, whether it attracts 0%, 5% or 12%, 18% or 28%. But they must and should have to mention the rate of tax applicable and the value of tax on the invoice. And the first and foremost thing we have to understand that the invoice will be issued by a seller to the buyer of the product. It identifies both the trading parties. Yes, it identifies both the trading parties. Here, who are the trading parties? The seller and the buyer. So in invoice, you can easily make out the details of the seller as well as the details of the buyer. So it identifies both the trading parties and lists, describes and quantifies the items sold. Yes, in invoice you are going to find out what and all the items are sold to the recipient or to the buyer. What is the price of the product? What kind of product is sold? What is the quantity of the product? Next, shows the date of shipment and mode of transport. Yes, it shows the date of shipment, on what date the product is sold and on what date the product is shipping from the seller point to the buyer point. And discount. Yes, if any discount is given, by the seller, then obviously the discount will be mentioned on the invoice, if any. And the delivery and payment terms. Yes, so the discount will be mentioned as well as the delivery and payment terms will also be mentioned in an invoice. So these are all the contents are going to be there in an invoice. So invoice will be issued by the seller to the buyer, and the invoice contains the details of both the parties, that is the buyer and the seller, and it also contains the details about the product, the price of the product. If any discount is given, the discount will be mentioned, the mode of payment, the payment made by the recipient or the buyer of the product, and delivery also. So on what date the item will be delivered, everything will be mentioned in the invoice. So invoice under GST. So in general sense, we got to know what is the meaning of invoice. But if it comes to GST, what is the meaning of GST and how the GST authority is going to determine the word invoice. So under the GST regime, an invoice or tax invoice means, under the GST regime, an invoice or tax invoice means the tax invoice referred to in section 31 of the CGST Act 2017. Yes, here in GST, section 31 of the CGST Act is going to determine what is invoice. And this section mandates the issuance of an invoice or a bill of supply of every supply of goods or services. Yes, it is mandatory that every registered person is supposed to issue the invoice to the recipient. Every registered person is supposed to issue the invoice to the buyer of the product, whether he's going to purchase the product, the goods or the services, but issuance of invoice is must and should. It is mandated by the GST authority to issue invoice. Next, the GST law mandates that any registered person buying goods or services from an unregistered person needs to issue a payment voucher as well as tax invoice. Yes, in some special circumstances, the buyer will be the registered person and seller will not be the registered person. Okay, for example, seller is a farmer. Okay, seller is a farmer or is an agriculturist, is not registered under the GST Act. As I am a business entity, as I am a registered person under GST, what I will do, I purchase some raw materials from farmer or from the agriculturist. So now what is my responsibility? I am supposed to issue a payment voucher. I am supposed to issue a payment voucher to the agriculturist or to the farmer, and I am supposed to issue the tax invoice on purchase, because I am the registered person and I am responsible to issue the tax invoice to the seller, because seller is a unregistered dealer. In general, the seller is going to issue the invoice. In case if the seller is not a registered dealer under GST, then it is the responsibility of the buyer to issue a payment voucher as well as a tax invoice with respect to that particular supply. And the importance of tax invoice under GST. Yes, why this tax invoice is important? What is the necessity of issuing of invoice? So here we have few important points which explains us why tax invoice is important. The first thing, under GST, a tax invoice is an important document. It not only evidences the supply of goods or services, but it is also an essential document for the recipient to avail input tax credit. Yes, under GST, a tax invoice is an important document. Yes, under GST regime, tax invoice is very much important. So if we don't have tax invoice, then we are not eligible to claim input tax credit, that is ITC. If you are running any business, and if you are going to purchase raw materials, for purchasing of each and every raw material, you are supposed to collect the tax invoice from the seller of the product. Got it? So without holding or without acquiring or without having the actual tax invoice, you are not supposed to claim ITC and you are not eligible to claim ITC. Next, a registered person cannot avail input tax credit unless he is in possession of tax invoice. Yes, as I said, as a registered person, as a registered manufacturer or as a registered business entity, if you are not in possession of the tax invoice, then you are not eligible to claim input tax credit, and it is not possible at all to claim input tax credit, because tax invoice is going to be the base to you to claim input tax credit. So how it is going to be base to claim input tax credit? Because if you are purchasing any product you need proof, right? You need proof that you have purchased the product. So this tax invoice is going to be the proof to shows that you purchase some product, right? So with that intention, the tax invoice is very much important. The next thing, GST is chargeable at the time of supply. Yes, GST is chargeable at the time of supply. Invoice is an important indicator of the time of supply. Yes. So we have a concept in GST, we have a concept called time of supply. So based on the time of supply, the tax will be collected from the seller or the business entity. So from where we will get to know about time of supply? From tax invoice, we will get to know about time of supply. So what and all will be there in the tax invoice to find out the time of supply? Yes, the date of receipt will be mentioned, date of payment will be mentioned, and the mode of payment will be mentioned in the tax invoice. So by using this kind of informations, we can easily find out the time of supply, and it will be very helpful to us to find out the time of supply and to impose the tax on that particular supply in a prescribed period. So these are all the very important aspects which says about why tax invoice is important under tax regime. Moving on, contents of invoice. So invoice contains so many informations. That bill or the receipt contains so many information. So what and all the informations are going to be there in an invoice or in a receipt or in a tax invoice? Now we will study about that. First information, name, address and GST IN of the supplier. Yes, the supplier name will be mentioned in the GST invoice or in the tax invoice, and the address of the supplier, what is the name of the company and address of the company, and GSTN number of that particular company, that is the supplier. So this information you can find out in tax invoice, and a consecutive serial number in one or multiple series containing alphabets or numerals or special characters like hyphen or dash and slash. Yes, the GSTN number will be issued, and it contains, the GSTN number contains alphanumerical series. So alphanumerical series is going to be there in GSTN number, and you're also going to find out different types of symbols like hyphen or dash or slash, like the hyphen or dash, like this kind of symbols you're going to see in tax invoice. Next, date of its issue. Yes, in tax invoice, easily you can find out the date of issue of invoice, on what date the invoice is issued, on what date the invoice is generated. About this, you'll get to know. Next, the name, address and GSTN or UIN if registered of the recipient. Yes, in invoice, you're also going to find out the name of the recipient, that is the buyer, address of the buyer, and if the buyer is a registered person, then his GST number will also be mentioned, or unique identification number. If there is any unique identification number of that particular buyer, that will also be mentioned in the invoice. Next, name and address of the recipient and the address of delivery along with the name of state and its PIN code if such recipient is unregistered and where the value of taxable supply is 50,000 rupees or more. Yes, if the supplier is supplying the goods and if the value of those goods is more than, if it is more than 50,000, then the supplier is supposed to mention the name, address of the recipient and also the full address of delivery along with the name of the state and PIN code, and with the PIN code of that particular address of delivery. In case if the transaction is happening more than 50,000, if the transaction is happening with more than 50,000 of value, then the supplier is supposed to mention the name and address of the recipient as well as the address of delivery along with the state and PIN code. Next, HSN code of goods or accounting code of services. Yes, there will be a unique number will be given by the GST authority to each and every goods as well as services. If any goods is sold, for example, if a pen is sold, a different HSN number will be given to that pen. If a camera is sold, if a phone is sold, a different HSN number, unique number will be given to that product, and you can easily find out that information in tax invoice. Moving on, description of goods or services. Yes, in invoice, you can easily find out what kind of goods is sold, right? What kind of goods, what is the quantity of that goods, whether it's 1 kilo or half kilo, or what is the measurement of that goods, whether it's 1 feet, 2 feet. So that information will be given and you can easily make out that information in tax invoice. Next, quantity in case of goods and unit or unique quantity code thereof. So quantity in case of goods and unit or unique quantity code thereof. Yes. So what quantity of goods sold, whether it's 1 piece or 2 piece, whether it's 10 units or 20 units, that will be mentioned in the invoice. Next, total value of supply of goods or services or both. Yes, what is the total value of that goods? The total value. If you are purchasing 4 items, then what will be the total value of that 4 items? That will be mentioned in the invoice. And taxable value of supply of goods or services or both, taking into account the discount or abatement if any. Yes. While you are selling the goods, fine. First we are going to calculate the actual value, actual total value. After calculating the actual total value, we will be deducting any discounts is given. If any discounts is given, we will be deducting that discount, or if any abatement is applicable, we will be giving that abatement, that is reduction in the rate of the goods. So that you can make out in invoice. Next, rate of tax. Yes. So what rate of tax is applicable and what tax is applicable? CGST, SGST or IGST or UTGST, that we have to mention in tax invoice. Next, amount of tax charged in respect of taxable goods or services. Yes, after mentioning the rate of tax, now we have to mention the value of tax. If the rate of tax is 18%, then what will be the value for 18%? Like say we are selling the goods worth rupees 10,000. Okay, the total value of goods is 10,000 and rate of tax applicable is 18%. So rate of tax applicable is 18%. So now what is the value of 18%? 10,000 into 18%. You will get 1,800. So this is the value of tax, 1,800. So this will be mentioned in the invoice. Next, place of supply along with the name of state in case of supply in the course of interstate trade or commerce. Yes, place of supply and name with the state. So from where he is supplying the goods and to where he is supplying. From where to where. In case if the transaction is happening between 2 states, interstate. The transaction is happening between 2 states, this information will be given. So next, moving on, address of delivery where the same is different from the place of supply. Yes, if the address of delivery is different from the place of supply, then we have to mention the address of delivery. Yes, so the buyer is in different state and the seller is in different state. At that point of time, we have to mention the address of delivery. Next, whether the tax is payable on reverse charge basis, where the tax is payable on reverse charge basis. Yes, sometimes the tax is applicable on reverse charge basis. So when reverse charge is applicable, when the supplier is an unregistered dealer, then the reverse charge concept will arise. So then what is reverse charge? Reverse charge is nothing but the supplier is going to be the unregistered dealer and the buyer is going to be the registered dealer. At that point of time, they have to mention whether the transaction is happening under forward charge mechanism or reverse charge mechanism. Signature or digital signature of the supplier or is authorized representative? Yes, in an invoice we have to put the digital signature of our business or the supplier, or is authorized representative. Yes, the authorized representative or the business entity or the supplier have to put the digital signature on invoice. So these are all the contents should be there in a invoice. So next, moving on to know about the pro forma of an invoice, how an invoice looks like exactly. So now I will show you what and all the items are going to be contained in a particular invoice. So invoice is going to be in a sheet. They'll give you a printed invoice. Sometimes they give you the digital invoice or the electric invoice. So here in invoice, first they have to mention the company name, ABC Company Limited. First they have to mention the company name, ABC Company Limited. Then they have to mention their address. So say Mysuru 57009. So the company now, it is situated in Mysuru. They are supplying from Mysuru. So they have to mention the place from where they are doing the business. Next, they also have to mention the GST IN number. GST IN number. Like say ABC 004T9. So this is how they are going to give the GSTN number with alphanumerical series. So this they have to mention, and if they want to mention, they can mention the company phone number, like say mobile number they can mention, and mail ID they can mention, company mail ID they can mention. Next, they have to mention the date. They will be writing the date in the right side. So on what date they are supplying the goods. Let us say like 5th April 2022. They'll mention the date. Next, they're supposed to give the information about the product, what product they are selling. Suppose XYZ product, and they are selling 2 units, and each unit costs say like 150 rupees, and now the total comes to 300, and they're also selling PQR product and selling 2 units, each unit cost 400, total comes to 800. Next, the total of this, it comes to 1100. Okay, and now they have to mention the rate of tax. What is the tax applicable? So tax at, let us take example of 10%. Let us assume the rate of tax applicable is 10%. So on 1100, tax is 110. So now total it, you will get 1210. So that is the total value. So now the total value of supply is 1210. The value of goods is 1100 and applicable tax is 110. So total comes to 1210. At the end, they will be putting their say like digital signature, and in the left side corner they are going to mention the address of delivery. Address of delivery, to whom the item is supposed to be delivered. So this and all the informations what they are going to mention in invoice. So moving on to this concept is very much important, that is credit note. So sometimes the supplier is supposed to issue the credit note to the recipient. In what circumstances they are supposed to issue the credit note? So in cases where tax invoice has been issued for a supply and subsequently it is found that the value or tax charged, in that invoice is more than, yes, tax charge in that invoice is more than what is actually payable or chargeable, or where the recipient has returned the goods, the supplier can issue a credit note to the recipient. Yes, sometimes while selling the product, in some confusions with some mistakes, what we will do, we will charge high rate of tax. Instead of charging 12%, what I did, I charged 18%. Or instead of collecting 1000 rupees, what I did, I collected 2000. Okay, in that case, in order to return the excess amount, to the recipient, we are supposed to issue a credit note. Got it? So, when you sell the product, at that point of time, if you charge more than the actual price, if you charge more than the actual tax rate, then you are supposed to issue a credit note to the supplier. As well as in another situation, that is returned. Yes, if the recipient returns the goods, at that point of time also, we are going to issue the credit note to the recipient. Next, debit note. So, when debit note is applicable? So, now we all got to know when credit note is applicable. If the supplier is going to charge the high rate of tax or higher value, at that point of time he is supposed to issue the credit note and is supposed to pay back the excess amount whatever he collected from the customer. In debit note, in cases where tax invoice has been issued for a supply of, subsequently it is found that the value or tax charged in the invoice is less than what is actually payable or chargeable. What is actually payable or chargeable, the supplier can issue debit note to the recipient. Yes. Suppose we are supposed to calculate, or we are supposed to collect the tax at 12%. We are supposed to collect the tax at 12%. But what I did, I collected 5% of tax. Okay, I am supposed to collect 12%, but I collected only 5%. Now still I am supposed to collect extra 7% of tax from the recipient. So now what I am supposed to do? I am supposed to issue a debit note to the recipient by stating that I am supposed to collect 12%. By mistake I have collected only 5%. So still you need to pay extra 7% of tax. By stating this information, you are supposed to issue the debit note. And you are supposed to collect 2000 rupees of value. The total value you are supposed to collect is 2000. But in mistake, you collected only 1500. You mentioned only 1500 in the invoice. So when the amount is when the amount mentioned, so when the actual amount mentioned on the invoice is less than the actual amount supposed to be collected, then you are supposed to issue a debit note to the recipient. So credit note, at what point of time we are going to issue? In case if the rate of tax is charged more than the actual tax rate, or if the amount is charged more than the actual value, then the credit note is supposed to be issued. When the debit note is supposed to be issued, when the tax rate charged is actually less than the actual tax rate. The tax rate charged is less than the actual tax rate, then at that point of time you are supposed to issue the debit note. So in today's class we discussed about tax invoice, the meaning of tax invoice, and tax invoice under GST, importance of tax invoice, and the contents of tax invoice, and we also discussed about pro forma of tax invoice and debit note as well as on credit note. I hope all of you understood the topic. We will meet you in the upcoming sessions with some more new topics. Until then, thank you all.